Good evening, welcome to Artist Space Books and Talks. Thank you all for coming to our first talk event in the basement of 55 Walton Street. It feels very intimate down here. Just a point of order before we begin that if you feel the need to go to the bathroom during the talk, please don't go to the one at the back there, go to the one upstairs. Thank you. We're very happy to tonight be presenting the second in a series of 4 programs occurring over a 6-week period. Together these bi-weekly talks constitute the presentation of a series of propositions by the writer and cultural theorist Suhail Malik on the conditions and shortcomings of contemporary art. Specifically, they frame the notion of art's exit from contemporary art, a position that Suhail has defined through his writing and teaching over a number of years. So if you were able to join us 2 weeks ago for the first in this series of presentations, you will have experienced and listened to Suhail outlining what he termed the anarcho-realist maxim of contemporary art, a maxim that he sees as being rooted in the general edict that an effective and genuinely political art, a real art, is not actually existing art. As contemporary art affirms itself through seeking to detach itself from its current institutions, its logic of escape is equally that of the endgame. Art as an undertaking is reduced to a matter of good faith through the manner in which its reality refutes its own maxim and is destined to fall short of these principles. So Suhail concluded last week, 2 weeks ago, the talk with the proposition that in order to truly consider an effectively political art, there is a need to consider another logic and set of terms for art than those imposed by its anarcho-realist maxim. So his talk this week continues on from this proposition and is formulated under the title, "The Problem with Contemporary Art is Not the Contemporary." So the general format of these talks is that Suhail will give his presentation, and following his presentation, he is joined in each session by a respondent to offer some immediate thoughts before we open up to a Q&A with the audience and a wider discussion, hopefully. So tonight we're very pleased to be joined by artist Liam Gillick, who will fulfill the kind of role of interlocutor and then open it up to questions from the audience. So just to, for those of you who weren't here on the first week of the talk, in this series of talks, I'm going to provide a formal introduction to Suhail. His writing and teaching addresses political economy, theory, and the axioms of contemporary art, and he has published widely on these subjects. He holds a readership in critical studies at Goldsmiths, London, where he is also programme co-director of the MFA in Fine Art. And for the last academic year, Suhail has been a visiting fellow at the Centre for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, New York. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Suhail.
Thank you, Richard. There's a problem with this mic, because it's a roving mic. Okay, thanks for the intro, Richard, and again for the opportunity to present this line of inquiry, which is a sort of not fully formed line of inquiry here at Artist Space. And before I do the talk itself, I want to restate, I guess, the terms of engagement with contemporary art, which I'll be presenting in this series. I did this at the beginning of the last talk, so apologies if you've read it already. These talks turn not on art itself, the artwork, but on the axioms of contemporary art. By axioms, I mean the conditions and logic by which the terms of contemporary art get their meaning and operational effects, which is of course to say for the artwork itself, but also for the discourses, the judgments, institutions, and the building work of contemporary art. So 2 points around the axioms. Firstly, the issue of these talks is establishing that contemporary art does have a logic and it can be identified, which I think is counterintuitive to the proposition. Secondly, that the terms of contemporary art are sometimes artworks, but not always or necessarily so. So technical problem. Speaker to the mic. Okay. Thank you. Okay, thank you. All right, so the axioms, the conditions and logic by which the terms of contemporary art get their meaning and operational effects. The reason to go to axioms rather than look at artworks or consider artworks is to establish that contemporary art does have a logic, despite almost everything that we hear saying otherwise. And also that Sometimes the terms of contemporary art are sometimes artworks, but not always, and not necessarily always so. The terms of contemporary art are also the commonplaces, the discourses, the legitimations, and institutional practices that constitute contemporary art as a field of activity. Which is why I think it has to be a matter of looking at the terms of contemporary art as a field, which we understand through axioms, rather than going for artworks. So there's several corollaries to this. Firstly, the subject of these talks is not art, is art, but not artworks nor artists. And I think it's possible and perfectly cogent to talk about art without talking about artworks or artists. The argument is in art, even if it is not art itself. Secondly, as a discussion of art's axioms, the claims made here are totalizing or concern the dominant forms of the field. And thirdly, this is a theoretically led argument and demand on art. Okay? This isn't an argument that comes from art, it's an argument put to art. And for these reasons, and despite the insistence of the current paradigm of contemporary art, these talks do not draw upon or run through particular artworks. They don't respect the singularity of the artwork. I'm not sure that's, for me, any longer a way to think about art or consider art. To consider artworks, to take artworks up in their singularity, their particularity, and so on, which is the paradigm of contemporary art. To do that would be to draw attention away from establishing the axioms and the logic of contemporary art, which of course are never just particular, never just singular, but cover the field systemically. It would draw attention away from identifying the global logic of contemporary art. Okay? So that's the prelude. The problem with contemporary art is not the contemporary. Now, it is a truth held to be self-evident that we are in contemporary art. It can't be any other way, of course. Contemporary art is just the art that is being made now, and so if you're involved in art now, not just making it, but involved in its discourses, curating, exhibiting, publishing, distributional and presentational structures, then we are doing contemporary art. Here we are. But this temporal identification presumes too much, and also in its self-evidence occludes various severe problems which cut all the way through to how contemporary art can be identified at all. It's identified both in its most intimate constitutive aspects, usually attributed to the artwork itself, as well as in its broad determinations, institutional paradigms, the politics and social field of the art scene. The axiomatic questions addressed in this talk are, if contemporary art is just what is being made, how then can we speak about it cogently and with any integrated sense of direction or place? How can we speak about art at all? Secondly, how can we know what contemporary art is up to as a whole? What is contemporary art doing in an aggregate form? And of course, the direct answer to these questions is that we shouldn't even ask these questions. All we can talk about are the particularities of individual practices, their demands and consolations, and whether they are successful in their own terms. The broad, if you want, generic questions kind of sort of violate the insistence on particularity and singularity of the artwork. Now we'll come back to this loss of bearings, the absence of criteria implied in this condition of necessary non-judgment later on. More immediately, what we do have is that contemporary art effectively then becomes a series of singularities, anecdotal, personal, or interpersonal. It becomes experienced. Okay? Because we can't ask the large, if you want, the axiomatic questions of art, but only look at singularities and particularities, what we're left with are basically anecdotes, personal, interpersonal experiences. Now, the evidence of this in the literature is provided, it's everywhere, but this is a particularly telling example. Juliana Rebentisch, German art theorist, says that this experiential condition and what she calls the reflective engagements with the work, with the artwork, in their own experience, is the key characteristic of contemporary art. She says, the quote on the screen, aesthetic experience is nothing that can be had by the subject. The term experience refers to a process between subject and object that transforms both subject and object. The object is transformed insofar as it is only in and through the dynamic of its experience that it is brought to life as a work of art. So it's not only just a thing, but an artwork by its encounter as an artwork. And the subject is transformed insofar as it takes on a self-reflective form its own performativity. Okay. And the same issue of October, there's an issue of October from about 3-4 years ago, asking the question, what is contemporary art? And the same issue, the contemporary art historian Terry Smith remarks on the same features typical of contemporary art for artists who have grown up with it. He says, contemporary art is full of doubtful gestures, equivocal objects, bemused paradoxes, tentative projections, diffident proposals, or wishful anticipations. This is the tone struck by most younger artists today. And in this, of course, he's absolutely right. The kind of tonal characteristic of contemporary art as you potter around the galleries and read about it in the journals is exactly this range. Now, Raymond Tish's and Smith's remarks, I think, capture pretty precisely the key features of contemporary art, generally speaking. But if they do so, such a characterization presents a fundamental problem for the languid description of contemporary art as just what is being made as art now. And that problem is precisely that insofar as art has definite characteristics, these two, aesthetic experience, this kind of tonality of the artwork, insofar as art does have definite characteristics, it can't just be anything that is being made. Okay? Now, these characteristics are nothing as severe as a definition that would stop downfilled gestures and the rest of it. But it's something looser than that, something that perhaps gives art a soft identity. Now, this identity is not at the level of a style of art, an object, a medium, or a venue, or any definite logic. Okay? We can't sort of prescribe, or we don't have a definite sense of what art is. But it has characteristics. As we've seen with Reventish's emphasis on the experience characteristic of contemporary art, and also Smith's account of its tonal uncertainty, if contemporary art can be characterized, it is more at the level of a form of proposal or a mode of address. For example, a mode of address such as question asking, which is a standard condition, or the standard condition articulated by artist statements and publicity in the art system now proposes that the artist has an interest in X, Y, and Z. But it goes no further. It's never quite explicitly stated what that interest amounts to. Maybe it's in the artwork, but again, that remains indefinite. And it's certainly never stated why that interest should matter. Artists just have an interest, and the press release kind of calibrates the artwork according to his interests, but it's left indefinite what the combination of interest and work should amount to, because it's up to you in the subjective experience of the work, in its singularity and particularity. So Smith goes further and notes how the questions posed by contemporary art and how they're posed have a historical aspect. He says, this generation of artists, contemporary artists now, share no single answer to the question of what is contemporary art. They begin from their experiences of living in the present, so that the questions for them become less a matter of what is contemporary art, and more one of which kinds of art might be made now, and how might they be made with others close to hand. Sort of proximity and currency, if you want, contemporaneity. Other questions. It's no longer a question of asking what is contemporary art, what is the contemporaneity. It's just stuff that happens in the proximity of production and exhibition. Smith continues, what makes the approaches of younger contemporary artists or contemporary artists distinct from the contemporary preoccupations of previous art, such as modernism, is that they are addressed explicitly, although more often implicitly, not only by each work of art to itself and to its contemporaries, there are also, and definitively, interrogations into the ontology of the present that ask, what is it to exist in the conditions of contemporaneity? Okay? So contemporaneity for Smith, contemporary art is addressed the question of what is it to exist now in the contemporary. I'm going to come back to this interrogation of the ontology of the present, that is contemporary art, later on in the lecture. It's a kind of core issue of this talk. More immediately, the point is that artists today, more accurately, contemporary artists today, have a common question, but no common answer. And they cannot have a common answer because art now is without definition, without style, without content, without specific definition, specific definite style, definite content, definite medium, definite interest. All of these things are left open, are open in contemporary art. And the tone taken by artists today is precisely interrogative, tenuous, hesitant, anticipatory, and equally, because the pivot of the contemporary art experience is its always singular experience of the art and its recipient together. And in that singularity, there is no definite identity as to what the art experience should be or has to be. Okay? It's an always singular experience, both in relationship to the singularity of the artwork, but also everyone's individual experience of the artwork should and ought to be singular in the art experience. And of course, if that's the characteristic experience of the artwork, sort of tonal conditions such as tenuousness, hesitancy, anticipation, and so on and so forth are perfect rhetorics, if you want, perfect forms of address of the artwork. Okay, so taken together, taken as typical of the claims that are often made of contemporary art, we can say that contemporary art is an art of indeterminacy. Apologies to those of you who have seen this from me many times. Poor people at CCS, maybe. Okay. Contemporary art is indeterminate in its content, and it is indeterminate in its address. And I'll come back to that next time. Another more familiar way of putting this characteristic of indeterminacy is that contemporary art has no definite criteria. It only lands, if you want, it lands transitively in the inconclusive experience of the artwork. Now this evacuating of definite criteria is in the work, this evacuating of definite criteria is the work contemporary art did against modernism and its very tight constraints on what counted as a legitimate move in and for art. And the importance of critics, of course, like Greenberg, Fried, and the kind of counter-critics in the sort of post-war period up to the 1970s. Okay, the critics set up criteria for what counted as legitimate work or what work should be investigating, and contemporary art just can't have that sort of criticism now. And also contemporary art moved against that kind of criticism, or if you want, the dominance or prescriptions of that sort of criticism. This move of contemporary art, the increasing dominance of contemporary art, began in earnest in the late 1950s with people like Capra, and achieved prevalence, if not prominence, by the 1980s, and then total spectrum domination in the metropolitan centres of the West since the mid-1980s, and globally since the mid-1990s. Contemporary art is a global phenomenon, as we'll see. Contemporary art, then, is a mode of address and a historical moment. Okay, it's both things. It's the mode of address because it's an art of indeterminacy, and it's a historical moment because it's the art since, let's say, since the 1960s. And then prominently since the 1980s. It's both a mode of address and a historical moment in which we find ourselves and to which there is no particular need to find a way out. Contemporary art, there's no need to find a way out because in part, contemporary art is itself the escape from dominant, regulated and administered forms of culture and society. In its tenuousness, hesitancy, question asking, if you want, in its criticality, contemporary art is the escape or the alternative to dominant oppressive forms of social control. So this is why find a way out of contemporary art. It itself is the escape, or the exit, or the alternative. But it's also no particular need to find a way out of contemporary art because its indeterminacy means that it cannot be clearly demarcated nor precisely defined. How to find a way out of something that doesn't have any borders. And it's just a series of question asking. Now, since contemporary art is at once both indeterminate in content and extent, right, in its content and in its border, in its definition, while that's one aspect of it, the indeterminacy aspect, while also being somewhat specific because it has these characteristics identified through Reventish and also Smith, it's specific in its mode of address, contemporary art has neither identity then, nor genre in the limited sense of genre. Yet, it can still be characterized with identifiable traits. This is kind of paradoxical, if you want, not quite contradictory, maybe just paradoxical object. It has neither genre nor identity, but it can be characterized with identifiable traits as a genre of genreless art. Well, we can put this another way. Contemporary art is a meta-genre of art without identity. And in both senses of without identity. Firstly, it is a genre of that art which has no identity, in that such an identity would fix and rescind indeterminacy. Okay? If you can say what contemporary art is, what it has to be, because there's an identity, then there's no indeterminacy in it. Tenuousness, question asking of the art field itself can't really take place. Okay? So contemporary art is with identity because it is indeterminate. The second way is it's without identity. Is that contemporary art is a meta-genre. Sorry, my text is a bit screwy here. Okay, it's a meta-genre without identity because contemporary art can encompass anything that is called art, and even following Duchamp and Caprau, notably, and plenty that isn't. Okay? So the art, non-art, or the art, anti-art, dialectic, or movement, or corporation, and so on, which I'll discuss more at the next talk, means that we can't really identify contemporary art. It precisely takes place in its interest in and action upon, and if you want, incorporation of non-art. That's a consequence of the history of the avant-gardes being the kind of primary condition of the art field now. Now, because of the first reason, that if we had an identity of contemporary art, we would fix or rescind indeterminacy. Because of this first reason, art has no identity, or as Caliban puts it, heterogeneity is the organizing principle of contemporary art. Usually a happy result. But for the second reason, that contemporary art incorporates non-art or anti-art, contemporary art is the name of all art that is made in the time that it is made. It's just a very simple notion for contemporary. It's just art that's made in the time that it's made, which is also, if you remember Terry Smith's notion of contemporary artists just addressing their circumstances, their fellow artists, and also the contemporary condition in which they find themselves. Okay. But if contemporary art is just the name of art which is made in the time that it's made, it means that contemporary art is the last name, the final word of art. Because it's all art that's happening now, forever. Okay. We have no other art now apart from contemporary art. Here we are. Now in this, contemporary art is the last name, the final word of art. We can have contemporary art indefinitely, let the party begin. It is now, and will continue to be just our condition, our standard. That's the characterization of the contemporary art field, and the kind of construction of it as a problem. Maybe not as a problem yet, but now it will become a problem. Now it's on this basis, if you want, that's the total description of contemporary art. Yeah, so I think that's the kind of logic of contemporary art. Now it's on this basis that we return to the earnest questioning of the ontology of the present that we saw Terry Smith earlier speaking about. And remember for Smith, what contemporary art interrogates is precisely the ontology of the present. The ontology of the present is just what is now, right? Is what contemporary art engages with. But we understand now that it has to, in part because the final word of art, as we have it now, has to be that art which is just being made now. Right? So it's a kind of tautological structure. But this tautology, it's nearly a tautology. This is the key sense in which contemporary art is contemporary. Thanks to its being made now, contemporary art allegedly addresses the present. Okay, that's what we saw Smith saying. And I still think that's the common sense, the kind of basic criteria, if you want, of of engagements in contemporary art. Why this art now? Why this position now? What is relevant now about this work, this art field, this discourse, this judgment, this institution, and so on. These are all judgments or questions that fix or try to ascertain the moment in art, generally speaking, to the contemporary. Okay? And then there's a reinforcement that contemporary art is just the art that is being made now, and it's off the now. Which is that contemporary art allegedly, we assume, addresses the present. We can say that anyone making art now, in any given now, in any modality of art now, is a contemporary artist, necessarily so. But the contention here is that it is because contemporary art addresses the now in and as a meta-genre without identity, okay, which is the indeterminacy of contemporary art, that it does not and cannot, in fact, face up to the contemporary. Okay? So I'm positing that there's a split between the two moments of how contemporary art is defined. On the one hand, you've got this mode of address, indeterminacy, meta-genre without identity, which is the kind of constitution of contemporary art in its discourses as an artwork and so on. And on the other hand, you've got contemporary art is of the now. And I'm saying that these two things cannot be identified with one another. In fact, they counteract one another. And because of the indeterminacy moment, because art is a meta-genre, contemporary art is a meta-genre without identity, it cannot face up to the contemporary. Okay? In which case, the interrogation of the contemporary, which we assume contemporary art to be doing, necessarily misses its target in the very attempt to reach it, the target being the contemporary. Okay? Contemporary art is necessarily inadequate to the now in which it takes place and to which it adds. Contemporary art is insufficient to the contemporary, inadequate to it. And that's a headline proposition which I'm now trying to elaborate. The argument returns to the ontology of the present, and I'll use initially Peter Osborne's quite fine articulation of the contemporaneity of contemporary art. Osborne's contended that the contemporary is a name for the coming together, the disjunctive unity of times. Okay? What he means by this is that, I've lost the slide. No, it's this one. Okay. What Osborne means by the coming together, the disjunctive unity of times, is that the contemporary involves a projection of unity onto the differential totality of the times of lives that are in principle or potentially present to each other in the same way at some particular time. Okay? Basically, in any given moment, at any given present, there are lots of times, there are lots of spatialities, particularities and so on. The name of the contemporary is the name which is the sort of cross-section through all of those times, histories, spatialities, experiences and so on. Okay? But that's a fiction. It's not the reality of the different times, histories, locales and so on. It's a projection of a unity. Okay, and it's also a projection of unity onto the differential totality of now, since it is the living present that provides the model of contemporaneity. Okay? But in being present to each other, which is the con of contemporaneity, at a particular time, the temporaneity of contemporaneity, okay? Times, lives, art are all contemporary to each other. Okay? And for Osborne, and this is just a kind of side note which I'll pick up. It's not the main argument, but it's a side note which I'll run through the talk. For Osborne, who's now commenting on the collective authorship of the Atlas Group, this fiction of authorship in the contemporary is the condition for what he calls the fictional collectivity, which is a stand-in for the missing political collectivity of the globally transnational, which is both posited and negated by capitalism itself. Now, Osborne's argument here is that capitalism constructs globalism, but it does it through abstraction and through relations of exchange, which are not about the particularities of the elements that are connected through capitalism. In other words, there's no political subject of globalization from capitalism. And the only way you could find a collective political subject is to project a unity to globalization, which would be something like a fictional collectivity, which would be contemporary to capital, to global capital in this sense. So for him, this big political stake's riding upon this projection of a fictional unity, the unity of the disjunctive present. What he's trying to articulate is that any politics adequate to globalization must assume its contemporaneity to capitalism's globalization. But that contemporaneity can only arrive through the fiction of a projected unity. So the fiction of contemporaneity permits a cogent narrative or narrator, the political collective, the fictional political collective, to be constructed against the dystopian abstract formality of global interconnectedness, which is globalism under capitalism. That's, as I said, that's somewhat of a side note. The key issue really is that the contemporaries is coming together, the disjunctive unity of all times, and then this notion that the contemporary involves a projection of unity onto the differential totality of times, which is to say the contemporary is a name for a disjunctive unity of times. If you want, each of us has our own times. We as a society of culture have our time, and there are other times. What's the name for all of these times taking place now? It's the contemporary. Okay? But that contemporaneity is a unity and a fiction or projection that there is a together of all of those times. And clearly you can understand the connection from that to globalization as a condition for thinking globalization. Okay? The proposal here is that contrary to this fictional account of the contemporary as a unified horizon of the present, the contention here is that the contemporary is rather a name for what, in fact, there is now without common horizon or unity. Okay, so Osborne's saying we need a projective unity, or there is a projective. The contemporary is a name for projective unity. The contention here is that the contemporary is a name for that which is without common horizon, without unity. Okay. The temporal now of the contemporary, then, is just the presentation of what is. And no unity, boundary, identity, cogency, coherence, or commonality other than this temporal manifestation. Right? The ontology of the present is just what is now without any unity. No unity can be ascribed to this multiplicity. As such, and to borrow a phrase from Alain Badiou, who I'm generally suspicious of, but is onto something with this, the contemporary is a name for the now as a multiple without identity. Okay. The now as a presentation of what is absent an integrating horizon. Okay. So it's just the disjunctive totality, but a totality without any unity or horizon to it. There is no totality for the present other than what there is now. Okay. The now has no identifiable totality, no integrating logic, no common mode of address in its contemporaneity. Being within time, okay, this sort of the collectivity, if you want. Being within time is only intra-relational co-presence between times, between lives, between experiences now, not at the level of a projected unity. It's only interrelational, it's only co-present without necessary coherence or horizon other than the fact of its being simultaneous. So the claim is a kind of an insistence on the timeline, that it's only the timeline that gives us any simultaneity, any contemporaneity, but there's no commonality, no integrating horizon, no condition which binds that presence to itself and everything that happens within it to itself, okay, to the elements within that. Any unity projected, okay, that's the last point. Any unity projected onto this disjunctive contemporaneity is precisely only a projection, okay? Only a phantasm or a fiction that forecloses on the now as only a multiplicity. Okay? And this is an idea, the sense of a projective unity, or the fiction that's needed to kind of give integrity, if you want, to the present is an idealism. And it's an idealism which is a mistake about what the now is that philosophy and concepts necessarily have to make, because philosophy and concepts are about presenting integrated, unified notions. Okay, that's what a concept does. It integrates elements together. Okay? Philosophy and concepts have to make that mistake about what the now is. The question is, does art have to? So taking the contemporary then as what is present without the fictional unity, of a common horizon or integration, and this means not just an integration right now, but integration that you think might happen at some other point. Retrospectively, we'll understand what the present is in its totality. Taking the contemporary as the present without the fiction of the common horizon, and taking contemporary art to somehow manifest this absence of integrity, art historians and theorists have recently expressed much anxiety about this condition, the dispersed multiple without identity as a condition of the present. Because of course, if the present is without identity, without unity, how do you construct a history? History being a narrative, precisely projective unity, that tells you what the story, the cogent, coherent moment of the present is, of the recent present. Okay? So I'll now go through several iterations of the anxiety facing art historians, contemporary art historians, who recognize that there's a problem in constructing any unity for the contemporary, for contemporary art. Okay? So let's start with the chief, Hal Foster, who introduces a special issue of October on this issue, the October issue, what is contemporary art. He says, in its very heterogeneity, such present practice, contemporary art, seems to float free of historical determination, conceptual definition, and critical judgment. Perfect statement of the anxiety that the present has no unity, no common condition of judgment. Okay? And Foster, here in 2009, reiterates a concern expressed earlier in 2004, where it says, our paradigm of no paradigm meaning that there's no unity, has abetted a flat indifference, a stagnant incommensurability, a consumerist touristic culture of art sampling. And for some, this paradigm of no paradigm, or condition of universal heterogeneity, is to be welcomed. Right? And it's to be welcomed as a result precisely of globalization. Okwai Rezo articulates it through a notion of the off-center, which for Rezo is structured by the simultaneous existence of multiple centers. Multiple centers meaning it's hard to identify a common unity. Okay? The off-center, he says, allows for the emergence of multiplicity, the breakdown of cultural and locational hierarchies, the absence of a singular locus. Good stuff. We like this stuff. Off-centered zones of production, distribution, and reception of the contemporary art articulate a dispersal of the universal, a refusal of the monolithic, a rebellion against the monocultural. Good stuff. And for others, the absence of criteria means the demise of making judgments on art. Sorry, I read that wrong. The absence of criteria means the demise of making judgments on art, of knowing what art is valid, formerly what we used to call good art, and what isn't, formerly what we used to call bad art. People still say good and bad art, but these are usually assertions of authority or anything else. Because how can you know? TJ Demos says, how can the single critic possibly analyze art's critical traction, identify structural operations, locate points of political resistance when one confronts practices that are so divergent and expansive in scope, practices that nonetheless possess cultural life in other parts of the world? It's kind of positivizing the point that Foster makes, which we saw a moment ago. Okay? Practices that function as shared and meaningful points of reference within their own sets of interpreters, critics, dealers, and curators. What he's saying is that there's no common unity to the art field. Okay? James Elkin says, art criticism is constitutionally in fundamental disarray. It often denies that it has a relevant history. It agrees to disagree about its purpose, and it routinely avoids confronting the absence of a plausible theory of critical judgment. Okay? The absence of a plausible theory of critical judgment. This leads to second-order incoherence, in that art criticism acknowledges its unresolved issues to be fundamental, but does not acknowledge why it is necessary to pursue these problems. Which is kind of to say, there's a big problem in art criticism, meh. I should have a slide with man, but I didn't think of it. Okay, now this condition of dissipated, criteria-less, boundary-less, unintegrated heterogeneity, that contemporary art can be anything, it can happen anywhere, at any time from now, and equally so. This has also been affirmed, okay, we see Demos partly affirming it, as a condition for new kinds of engagement and transformed opportunities and purpose. So, as regards globalization and cultural definition and exclusion, we have Julia Bryan-Wilson saying, contemporary art at its best offers a vibrant sense of inclusion, fostering inclusion because there's nothing to exclude. There's no criteria for exclusion. Okay? Offers a vibrant sense of inclusion, fostering collaborations between art historians, scientists, policymakers, activists, artists, as well as admitting all kinds of objects, canonical, mass media, otherwise. Chico Koge-Agalu says, when one considers the even more bewilderingly diverse practices that may not yet be part of the discussion, he's talking about kind of global terrain. That may not yet be part of the discussion, but which in their richness and substance are bound to crash the party sooner or later, it seems better to live with the likelihood that no singular models or paradigms will sufficiently help us wade through the murky, restless waters of today's contemporary art. Okay? Perfect iteration of the point Elkins made earlier. There's an incoherence, and we don't even ask why that's a problem. Okay? Here it's affirmed that there is incoherence. It's affirmed as an inclusivity. And finally, Isabel Graf says, the label contemporary art was meant to allow the art world to shake off its reputation for elitism. It suggests that being of your own time is all it takes to understand this art. The point that Terry Smith makes earlier. Right? For the being of your own time is all it takes to understand this art, for it too is a phenomenon of its time. Right? So, in this condition of non-integrity, without a unifying horizon, contemporary art can be much more inclusive. We don't even need to think about what art is or what art might be as a form of practice. It's simply enough just to be of its own time. This leads to a kind of celebration within criticism and judgment. Demos, again, the same piece. The critic's priorities must inevitably shift away from the exercise of expert judgment grounded in a presumed authority, the Greenbergian model, over the cultural field, and towards a post-judgment model of criticism. If you have judgment as a basis of criticism, the question is, what are your criteria of judgment? Criteria of judgment means that you have determinations of what constitutes a particular interest in art. And that means that art is not indeterminate. And if that's the case, if art is not indeterminate, you're no longer in the contemporary art field. I think this explains a lot of the wishy-washiness of contemporary art criticism. Right? It's a post-judgment model of criticism, one based in the practice of translation and research interpretation of cultural difference in a plural global field, where no one has the last word. You can see this applied to certain models of curating as well. No matter our practice. And then to come back to what art and art history might be doing, finally, the new kind of art history, says Joshua Shannon, the new kind of art history will require us also to take one step back, or at least from asking our art above all to serve the function of critique. That's no longer what art should be doing, says Joshua Shannon. It strikes him as in no way retrograde to seek instead to understand art as representation, as picturing the present, rather than posing problems for it. Picturing the present, which is there to describe it, present an image of it, without making a demand on it. And come back to Julia Bryan-Wilson. Contemporary art history, because it is always information, necessarily admits its own instabilities, its own fissures and holes. It cannot presume singular meanings, etched in stone as it were. So for worse or for better, all of these reflections and attributions suppose that contemporary art, as is reflected and embodied by, suppose all these reflections and attributions suppose that contemporaneity, as it is reflected and embodied by contemporary art, is, in the words of Terry Smith, a state of witless presentism. which seems to me a great name for a group show of contemporary art. The state of witness presentism. In fact, every group show. Or every solo. It's a problem. However, so this is the way that this condition of a non-integrated, non-unified present manifests in terms of anxieties or near celebrations by contemporary art historians. And in a way, they're the ones who are most anxious about this as a problem because they are art historians. And for it's incumbent upon them to present the narrative, the sense-making of the present as contemporary art historians. And they can't quite do it in traditional forms because the contemporary does not have any integrity. It cannot present a convincing total narrative of the contemporary. Okay? But as this last quotation from Julie Bryan Wilson highlights, the instabilities, she highlights the instabilities generated for contemporary art history by contemporary art's own boundarylessness and criterialessness, as do, I think, all of these citations I just presented. But I think in this, there is a fundamental confusion or mistaken identification. At the heart of this debate, at the heart of these anxieties and celebrations, is a fundamental misidentification. The mistake is to identify the now as multiple without identity, the now of the contemporary, the historico-temporal contemporaneity, with contemporary art as a meta-genre of indeterminacy. Okay? So all of these art historians they speak about the contemporary, but they attribute it to contemporary art. Okay? All the quotations about contemporary art, not about the contemporary. And that's a mistake. Okay? The basic scheme of the debate, or of the discussions I just presented, and elsewhere, is that the determination of art by the contemporary, the absolute heterogeneity of the now, rather than the determination of art by the contemporary, rather than other historical or disciplinary forces, puts pressure on art that is then manifest in art as its characteristic indeterminacy. Okay? So what all these critics and art historians are doing is saying that recognizing contemporary as this open, multiple, without identity, non-integrated, and so on. For them, this produces a pressure on art, which then, if you want, explodes art or eliminates, expunges art of any integrating horizon. But so they identify contemporary art with the contemporary as multiple without identity. But this identification does a disservice to the contemporary, okay? And misrecognizes what happens as the contemporary, what there is now. It misrecognizes what there is now as requiring indeterminate presentation. So for them, if contemporary art manifests the contemporaneity, in the absence of horizon, for them the contemporary is indeterminate. Okay? And for me that's the mistake. It's the mistake of contemporary art. It's a mistake because nothing in the unintegratable or constitutively heterogeneous now requires or stipulates that any element of it be indeterminate. Okay? The unintegrated now, which is the question of the horizon, nothing about the unintegration of the non-integration of the now requires any element of it to be indeterminate. Okay? No element of the now requires the total now to be defined in order for it to be defined. The heterogeneity and identitylessness of the contemporary, the present, is with regard to the totality, without horizon, of what is. Okay? It's the total. The totality of now does not have identity. That does not mean that anything that is now, right, is also without definition or indeterminate. It's pretty clear. We're here in Art and Space on a Friday evening. That's a very well-defined set, okay? Very well-defined element in the now. We don't need a total picture of the now in order to define what this term of the now constitutes. It's a mistake to say that because the now as a total thing, because there's no unity to the now, because that has to remain indeterminate, every element in the now is also indeterminate. or without definition. Identifying the absence of identity of the now with the absence of criteria for art, such that art is only a field of instabilities and fissures, tentative question asking, and so on. The multiplicity rather than singularity. Okay? Identifying the absence of identity of the now with the absence of criteria for art, an absence of meaning of art, specific definite meaning of art, in particular but also in general, this identification or even supposed pressure of the now as a present on art supposes that art in effect embodies, configures, or is even just somehow responsible and responsive to the now qua witless presentism. Okay? The identification of the multiple without identity as art determines that art as embodying each time the contemporary as such, as a multiple without identity. And so the mistake of the contemporary art historians, but I think also the other material we've looked at, is to say that the multiple without identity of art, the multiple without identity of the present is embodied in contemporary art. Okay? That, if you want, contemporary art is just the art that is made now and is the now. But we know that art is just an element of the contemporary because we have something we can call art. It's just an element of the contemporary. It's not everything. It need not have any responsibility to the contemporary or configure it. And furthermore, it cannot have any responsibility to the present, to the contemporary as present, because the contemporary as multiple without identity has no figure. How to have responsibility for something without a figure. Okay. And precisely, the contemporary as multiple without identity abrogates any identification. Because if you can identify the multiple without identity, it's no longer without identity. So contemporary art then, so that's the earlier point. So contemporary art substitutes the identitylessness of the present with its own indeterminacy. And it posits its own metageneric commonality, the metagenre without without identity of art. It posits its own metageneric commonality for the absence of unity of the present. It mistakes itself for the contemporary qua time. In this, contemporary art claims to represent contemporary art as a fetish for the present. And it replaces the present with an idealization of its unity. Okay? And this is the celebration of contemporary art as adequate to the present. It's actually just a fetishization of the present. It's actually a replacement of the present. And this is the false claim that contemporary art is adequate to the present. Okay? Or rather, contemporary art is adequate to the contemporary. The problem with contemporary art is not the contemporary. The problem for contemporary art, if you want, is the contemporary, but has a problem that it can't address. Configuring the horizonless now as indeterminate as contemporary art, okay? Configuring the present, the horizonless now as indeterminate in the way contemporary art is, mistakes the particularity of a specific element in the now, art, for the non-totality of the now. Okay? It supposes and posits that art somehow still represents the universal, what is, everything that is. And to that extent, it replicates modernism, if not art's much more older humanism in reverse, or from behind, or from below. Okay? That art somehow captures the universal being just what is now. An art is still doing that insofar as it claims that its meta-genre of identity is another name, or is a replacement or representation of the now without unity. And insofar as the constitutive indeterminacy of contemporary art and all its problems supposes that it is attached to the horizonless now, it operates at the same order of fiction that we previously saw ascribed to the contemporary as a disjunctive unity. Okay. So contemporary art does exactly and this is Peter Osborne's claim anyway, contemporary art does exactly the projection of a fictional unity, disjunctive unity, which he says is the name for the political subject of globalization. But what we then understand is that contemporary art is a fiction or an idealism from below. Okay, contemporary art is an idealism. So to summarize, and to conclude with a quick comment about globalization as well, identifying contemporary art with the contemporary qua what is makes a category mistake. It confounds and misrepresents the meta-genre of contemporary art for the non-totality of the present. And in doing so, it misses the contemporary as such. Okay? Because it's a meta-genre. There are definite characteristics. And having definite characteristics, it kind of gives a shadow, if you want, a shadow of a unity to the present. And in that extent, it misses the present. It misses the contemporary. It mistakes that the specific and determinable elements that constitute contemporary to be necessarily and best represented by contemporary art in its indeterminacy. And in this, it confuses and confounds the determinability and definition of what is, in fact, of what is presented with the absence of identity of the contemporary, of the present. Okay? It confuses the determinability and definition of what is presented with the absence of identity of the present. And that's the problem with contemporary art. Against this, in order to address the contemporary as it is, to address what is, and not just interrogate it with the tonalities and pathos of incompletion that Smith identifies, the pathos of indeterminacy, art needs to rid itself of the mistake of contemporary art. The mistake of confounding the specific for the whole, of the presented for the present. I'll leave the issues around globalization aside, because I'm overrunning. To abrogate or avoid the mistake of contemporary art requires and posits an art that is no longer beholden to indeterminacy of experience or to the intrinsic uncertainties of that which is the contemporary. Now, this is certainly available. It's not a big task. Indeterminacy is not anyway necessitated by the fact of the contemporary. That's the mistake of the contemporary art, that it assumes that indeterminacy is necessitated by the incomplete, by the non-unity of the contemporary. What we need to understand that the indeterminacy of contemporary art is only a meta-generic convention of art. In its mistake, contemporary art falls short of the contemporary, necessarily so. But otherwise, to address, this is a familiar refrain to some of you, but otherwise to address and be in the contemporary as such, and to be therefore in globalization as a fact, not as a fiction, we must then take leave of contemporary art. That's the talk today. What I'll do next time is try and articulate some of the points sort of halfway through the talk around why indeterminacy and the multiple without unity become the conditions of the contemporary art we live now.
Thank you, Suhail. The only way to respond to this, is, I realized as I was listening, is going to be for us to continue the discussion in a combination of French and Cockney rhyming slang. And exactly.
International art.
I actually made that classic mistake of uneducated people, which is to try and make notes without a method for making notes. So I've sort of basically rewrote the talk. But one of the things that I think is extremely striking here is this, the entire thing that you laid out does seem to, in a way for me, explain some of the hysteria, piety and indifference that surrounds contemporary art as a practice. And that's one of the things, of course, about contemporary art that's so devastating about it, that it is surrounded by hysteria, piety and indifference. And of course, as an artist myself, and you as someone engaged with artists all the time, the feeling of exceptionalism, the feeling that as an artist somehow at times you feel that, yes, this is all very well, but I'm an exception to this. What you really pointed out today, I think, structurally, is why it is that we feel often, when things work well, we feel we're an exception to this model, because of course the very model itself puts you in a position of feeling that you're an exception to it. What I liked particularly was the idea that you seem to find a way to explain why you have one has these feelings of exceptionalism or exclusion from this totality. And also this, which is connected to this kind of horizonless image, which is a particularly evocative one for me. So what I did is I just have a few observations that are not necessarily directly geared towards what was spoken about, but maybe what was not spoken about. And necessarily some of the things I'm going to say are going to sound less sophisticated than Suhail's way of putting things, but I think they're worth saying just to get it in the room, so when people have questions that we've at least opened up some things. And then I started to make a couple of quick columns, one of which was sort of productive and unproductive, but I decided instead of using that, I started writing attractive and ugly as my two
aesthetic
lists. Yes, because I was getting more and more excited about looking at art for some reason. So anyway, these, like I said, these are somewhat observations. Of course, and maybe things that you didn't quite put in a certain way. And I'm going to have 3 or 4 quick questions for you at the end, so you just have to bear with it. One of the things that I think that kept coming up is this feeling, this locating of art, in a way, seems to maybe not account for the evasive quality of contemporary art. The fact that any practitioner at any given moment is often reacting to this sense of indeterminacy and this fractured, this problem of the relationship between contemporary art and the contemporary. And they do this by producing bodies of work that are essentially evasive. They keep evading critique. It's a deliberate act. And some of this is connected to, I think, some of the semiotic confusion about art. This feeling that people like Terry Smith have, and I know Hal Foster has, probably quite rightly, but is connected to a certain understanding of reliable aesthetics. That there's something about what you were talking about today also makes it very difficult for people when they try to differentiate. They, for example, right now often equate the shiny with capitalism and things that are messy with being critical or being good. And you read this even written by very intelligent people, and you know that philosophically and aesthetically this cannot be that simple, for example. So there seems to me that there's a bit of a pseudo-ethical confusion sometimes about the relationship between institutions, for example, on one hand, maybe artist space when it's working really well, and, for example, galleries, right? Where we feel that the very same artist, whether it's Wally Gerard on one hand, who came up, or Hito Stowell, or even Jeff Koons, somehow is a different artist when they're in one place than when they're in another. When they're in a critical exhibition, or even Jeff Koons is often cited in Texte Kunst because he's useful to talk about certain things. He has a completely different function in the critical terrain when he's in a different environment. Of course, I wonder if the illusion of this sense of heterogeneity may tell us more about the history of criticism over the last 30 years than it does about the history of art. And I think Suhail touched on this a little bit, but I want to be interested to hear him talk a bit more about that, because I think we're both old enough to have grown up surrounded by conferences on the crisis of criticism and not maybe on the crisis of contemporary art. And it was a sort of, maybe you can explain why there's been this shift. And I have a kind of an image that came into my head as we were talking, because I was trying to think back over the last 25 years and wonder if there were, you know, beyond the powerful philosophical and political structure that Suhail put into place, is there something else going on that is not to do with the crisis of criticism or the crisis of contemporary art or the failure or the misapplication of theory? And one of the things I kept thinking about was the shift from analog to digital documentation in the 80s and early 90s. And the fact that what I was really thinking more about was talking to Anton Vidocla outside, because Eflux had also done another later issue on contemporary art, the crisis of contemporary art and the problem of contemporary art. And I was trying to think, why is this happening now? Why are we doing this? Has something fundamentally changed? Is there some complete shift in thinking, or has something become more extreme and worse than it was in 1990 or something like that? One of them I thought had to do with the way art is reproduced and the way images in the last few years have increased in resolution. If you look back, speaking as an artist who started showing in the late 80s, there's kind of a hole in the documentation of work that happens as there's this shift from analog to digital. And what happens is from about 2005 onwards, literally the resolution of the work starts to get higher and higher. And you start to be confronted, therefore, as a critical or self-conscious person, not only by your own resolution, as it were, and your own gigabyte requirements, but also you're surrounded by more and more reproductions of contemporary art. So in a recent series of lectures I did, I illustrated it almost entirely with images culled from Contemporary Art Daily, which is a paradigm. It is a structure which basically, in a way, makes a problem seem a bit more urgent, as far as I'm concerned. These appearances and these increased resolutions make something more visible and more important. One of the things I worried about a little bit is that as we headed, I want you to clarify this if you can at some point. As we headed towards the end, I kept thinking, well, what we really need to do, therefore, is to look at art more carefully, in a way, or examine art, or the situation of art-like activity more carefully. It seemed to me maybe something that slightly I couldn't tell how that could be done, or how your final way of talking about the mistake of contemporary art, which would require an ability to differentiate and notice the specifics of the now against the mistake of the contemporary in relation to contemporary, this kind of feeling of the contemporary. Maybe you can talk about that. In order to kind of make sure that we have time to talk openly, I wanted to just ask you, and I think you should now start to answer some of these things and have a conversation. One of the things that I want you to address a little bit was the claims made for art. Because as we talked about these two systems, one, this kind of critical befuddlement with the state of contemporary art, that it's something that can't be distinguished, everything is kind of in this, relativistic soup, and also on the other hand, the floundering of artists at times. What do you make of the claims for art when you read a Biennale catalogue, when you read a Documenta reader, when you even read October magazine, the average press release? Forget about what do we call it, international art English. What do you make of the claims made of contemporary art, which seem to become higher and more profound as this structure you've described becomes more problematic? Yeah, I think it.
Okay.
Good. I have a few more.
Okay. I'll try and be brief this time. loquacious last time. I think the claims of contemporary art are now highly inflated. And usually the cause of inflation is, again, let's be general rather than specific. Usually the claims are of an order of X is interested in A, B, and C. A, B, and C are quite large things and not very well, usually not very well defined. Sometimes they can be quite well defined. And somehow, by virtue, as I said in the talk, by virtue of an interest in or a reflection on or taking up the questions of, there's a sense in which the artist is necessarily making a contribution to the thinking up or the presentation, exhibition, or the visualization, or the hearing of A, B, and C. But one, I don't understand quite why it would be assumed that one would have an interest. It's like, yes.
Who wouldn't have the interest? The art?
Anyone who's being involved in it as a viewer and audience or as an institution. So the question, I mean, I've been looking at press releases quite carefully, such as mine, I agree. I've been looking at press releases quite carefully, sort of thinking about, because something the talk about indeterminacy is to do with the rhetorics of contemporary art, not just of the artwork, but also.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to know, really, if that's what you also meant.
Both.
Right.
Both. And in a way, the kind of configuration of press releases matches very well the way, what I would call contemporary art as a genre, which I don't think is all art that is happening now, right? As a genre. The indeterminacy of the press releases matches very well with the indeterminacy of the artwork. So some stabs are made at this or that, so issues A, B, and C, or topic A, B, and C. But if you want the net result of which is left to the viewer in terms of their experience. And the press release kind of sort of reiterates that, but gives a bit more definition, a bit more resolution, to use your term, on the claims of the art. What this allows for, on the one hand, is a kind of narrowing and sort of microscopic becoming miniature of why one might be interested, or what the artist is trying to do specifically, but at the same time also a kind of grand inflation of the many things that art could be involved in or trying to claim. So it's a kind of double move.
But we know, this brings me to the curatorial role, because we know that in the last, certainly in the last 20 years, if we come back to this question of writing, the writings or claims around art haven't necessarily been specific to discrete or even embedded or useful artworks in their own right. I mean, thinking about Documenta 10, which I was involved in, there was nothing in the writing around the exhibition itself that's talked about specific artworks. It might talk about practices or make claims for practices. And so in your model, do you see, has there been a sort of, someone mentioned the other day they felt that we were in a kind of a dark ages, we've been equivalent to the dark ages of thinking, and has there been something that's kept going, has had meaning? Has this sense that there's been a discussion of practices and exhibitions and structures that have to have something in them, has this been the dynamic? Is this something that's evaded the problem? I'm not being very clear.
Yeah,
it's hard to pin down.
Compensatory moments, or kind of another moment than this.
Well, what you're structurally laying out still seems to be based on a kind of contemporary art daily idea of all this contemporary art, and in relation to the bafflement of, or the inability of certain critics to be able to discriminate between or distinguish between one art and another in the face of the elegant proposition about the contemporary and contemporary art, right? So what about the fact that certainly since Documenta 10, all of the writing around certain structures has tended to avoid talking about art anyway. It's talked about structures. You see what I mean? The claims for Documenta 10 were not that my work can do anything, but the whole of Documenta 10 can do something.
Yeah. Well, I think on the one hand that curators can't afford to be quite as anecdotal or indeterminate as artists can, because they have to mediate, present the discourse of the work. So there's kind of more sense giving on the curator's side than the artist's side. specifics and skill. So, but I don't think, so that's on the one hand, there's more definitional precision to the claim of the curator of the artwork, and therefore less in the genre of contemporary art. But on the other hand, I think when one looks at the claims of the discourses themselves, they're usually towards some, my guess is, they say, well, we can't really talk about the work itself because one has to encounter it, each to their own specific subjective experience and so on and so forth. And that seems to me the standard claim of art criticism that tries to be as precise as possible, partly because prevalent art criticism, the Euro-American sphere, is informed by post-structuralism.
Right.
Puts work towards a singularity experience. Okay? So you have very kind of sophisticated, precise elaboration, examination of what work is, historically, and say critically, but in a way the work that's sort of that's thought worth to be spending time on and examining. The claim made somewhere at some level seems to me to kind of repeat the standard doxa of indeterminacy in terms of
right.
It's all fine in the end. Because so on the one hand, there's a kind of deflation of discourses. I mean, there's a not deflation, but there's a discourses are kind of shifted over. Well, the need for discourse and sense or meaning making is shifted over to stuff outside of the artwork itself, the press release, the curator, and so on, and also institutions. But on the other hand, it seems to me that for all of the effort made in discursive articulation by those structures, they still end up at the same point as the claims of contemporary artwork. Which is why at the beginning I think I was saying that contemporary art is not just the artwork, but I see a continuity between sort of discursive elements, institutional elements, and artists and artworks as well.
You focus quite a lot on that particular issue of October magazine, which seems perfectly reasonable because we're sitting in New York and people are familiar with it and have had time to digest it. It's been responded to, at least in some forms already. One thing, however, that often doesn't really get spoken about openly around that journal or that issue particularly, is that you're not with every entry, because it was quite wide, the people that they looked at to a certain extent. But the general tenor was that if art could have better civics, you know, and better, and people had better taste and stopped sort of messing around, yeah, and learned to read, that actually a lot of this would be over, like there wouldn't be this problem. But somehow, that comes back to the Dark Ages model, that somehow, that if you can keep the flame of like piety, Puritanism, and sublime kind of late modernism going somehow, with a political twist, that somehow everything will be fine. Do you believe that the system that you've laid out can you just keep your head down and do the right thing and get through it? It's a serious question, because I think some people think that way, and I know some of them, and they've tried to be decent, and that's, you know.
I hope it was clear I wasn't necessarily subscribing to the October Manifesto. No,
is that right? I mean, not,
no, absolutely not.
Well, I don't know.
Absolutely not, because precisely that version of art would presume the adequacy of art history as a kind of narrative of what art is up to now, given that it's gone through a mutation from the modern to the contemporary. And I think some of the contributions, there's a sense in which we can restore some notion of integrity to contemporary art. Not quite on the basis of the modern, so I understand that's finished, but there would be something to be kind of resolved from it. And others recognize that there's a fundamental problem in the sense that the horizon is gone. But I think even for that, I also fundamentally disagree with that approach of representative in October and what it stands for. But even within the more the kind of more proximate moments to what I'd be articulating under contemporary, there is still a sense in which they say, well, contemporary art is contemporary because it represents the contemporary.
Right.
And that for me is a mistake, because my claim is that what they in fact do is set up, this comes back to your earlier question in terms of the claims made for art, what they in fact do is set up contemporary art as a genre of indeterminacy.
Right.
And then they kind of say, well, this genre of indeterminacy happens, contrasted to modern art, happens because of the pressure of the dispersed contemporary on art. So the dispersed, unintegrated contemporary channels into every, sort of specifies specifically, determines specifically every single artwork and generates indeterminacy, because how do you know what the final meaning of an artwork is? You can't possibly. So we just left in the singularity of experiences. And that's the theoretical mistake. But I think that theoretical mistake is another way, this is the point I was making about recovering humanism, that the mistake it makes is to say that contemporary art is a fetish for the contemporary. And that comes back to the kind of sort of modernist training, basically, kind of like late modernist training that you were describing. So for me, it's a kind of careful trajectory. It's not quite a rearticulation of those claims from the late 60s into the early 70s, and which is also the moment that post-structuralism entered the art field through these critics.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a kind of vindication of the sense that contemporary art can speak to our time through its indeterminacy. My claim is that it can't, because it's a genre. If it is of our time, it's of our time insofar as it won't be a genre, because I accept that the contemporary, there's no integrity to the contemporary. It's just what is.
Right. I just want to ask one quick question, and then I want to open it up. And it's sort of, it's a bit like in the pub question in the sense, you know, kind of a reflection on this, even though there's still more lectures to come, but particularly tonight it was such a strong laying out of a kind of a way of seeing how something's working. It was so strong to me that I wanted to ask you that with all this focus upon contemporary art and the mistake of contemporary art and all of the issues you laid out, and obviously the recent focus of, and even an appearance of contemporary art historians, often for the first time, as a term, as a kind of job, as an area of focus. Do you think that something's going to change, at least in the terms of terminology? I already noticed a lot of people don't. Contemporary art was never an uttered term. People didn't used to say ever really, I'm a contemporary artist. It sounds kind of stupid. But certainly they were happy to be within this amoebic kind of swamp of contemporary art, so it's convenient. But do you see that there's going to be a shift in terminology? Do you already experience it when you talk to your colleagues, contemporaries?
Well, it's accepted as a term.
Right.
You know, contemporary art is just what we're in the sense that there might be something else in contemporary art that just doesn't seem available. I mean, there are of course other types of art,
yes,
but they're not of critical interest.
Right.
So there's a way in which, well, if you want to do something critically, theoretically, politically, socially interesting, one does contemporary art. Because those are the terms of the sophisticated discourse that we're in, and that's what one wants to contribute to. So there's a sense in which one doesn't really need to, I mean, for myself, I used to just speak about art, understanding that the field I'm in is a field in which art is made, and yes, it's contemporary art, but maybe that's just that's a genre. What I'm now interested in is identifying more the specifics to contemporary art. But I'm not sure contemporary art historians, for me, looking at the October issue and the following work, it still seems to me that the claim, the assumption is contemporary art historians are just historians of recent art. The question is how far is recent? So you can then sort of do some finessing according to your preferences. Or the other claim is that, well, all art was always contemporary to its time. So, and there's a book by Richard Myers, which is, I can't remember, I think something has. Somebody help me. Richard Myers book. Good, I'm glad. There's a book by Richard Myers which is set in, I think it's about Africa, saying, well, yeah, these guys are doing modernism, but it's contemporary to its time. So all art was once contemporary. But that seems to me, that's the category mistake. Because what they're saying is just like stuff that happens now is contemporary. And contemporary art is not a genre, but it is a genre. It's a very specific type of practice, which I kind of tried to identify last time and a bit in the determinacy claim this time. So for me, the issue now is I think contemporary art will kind of vacillate a bit. Just art will become contemporary art because of this confusion. But I think the contemporary art historians are forcing the confusion and making it more central, and not allowing on the notion of art, because anything that's made will be contemporary art. So for me, it's a very important move to kind of, as I might say, I think it's an important move to kind of distinguish the two notions of the contemporary.
Right.
Just to come back to one thing about the civility issue. I mean, other work which wasn't presented.
Civility.
You said civics?
Civics, and citizen maybe as well, which could be another...
Civics in the art field. Yeah, that's something I want to come back to in the fourth talk.
Okay. So I think now we'll move back from French and Cockney rhyming slang into English, and if there are any questions from the floor, it would be good I have more questions, but I'm not going to ask them. This one in the front.
Sorry, I just want to come back to Liam's question regarding this sort of increasingly higher stakes or higher claims of art, of contemporary art. So kind of the whole talk, I was just wondering what the problem was. So it seemed like a very descriptive way of sort of saying, this is what's happening, this is etc. So like I was just wondering where kind of the moment of crisis really stood. And the more I was thinking about it, the more I realized that perhaps the moment of crisis is in this understanding that if indeed contemporary art cannot face the contemporary, we're basically in a mechanism of constant inclusion and disavowal and evasion. As a result, when Liam asked that question about the higher stakes and the kind of the ethical, what I imagine the ethical political dimension of contemporary art is now, so then there's this kind of uneasy disjuncture when the claims are so high about the emancipatory potential of contemporary art, yet we're in a constant process of disavowal of the actual reality that makes that a possibility. So I'm just wondering whether that's the moment of crisis that we're supposed to face or not.
Yeah. I don't see that the claims of, I mean, I disagree with Liam, I don't see the claims of contemporary art being that high. They seem extremely parochial to me. So, I mean, they're inflated, for sure, but the way that they're dealt with doesn't seem to me to kind of extend very much beyond the interests of the art field. And where they do enter explicitly into the social domain, well, we all know the problems there. Right? So there's a sense in which there's a rhetoric of, not rhetoric, there's a yeah, the claims are high, but the effects are pretty parochial, I think. And the issue then for me, if you want, if the question is something about how to attach the central contention that contemporary art can't face the contemporary to what that cashes out as in terms of the mechanisms of politics or effects of the art field, it seems to me that the art field is generally a polite mechanism now. Really.
But one of the reasons I mentioned it, just because it's
polite and self-regulating mechanism.
Right. But one of the reasons I brought up, and I think that relates to the question, is that if and it's the wrong way to understand your talk, I think. Structurally it's completely wrong, analytically it's wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. When we're looking for, when you're looking for the guilty party, which of course I'm not, and I shouldn't be, but if we try and imagine for a second. If you, okay, look at it like Game of Thrones, right? If I'm trying to kill all the people who are pretending to the throne or something, right? Who am I looking for? Do you see what I mean? Like, am I looking for the people that appear to be these...
Look very far, here we are.
No, but could I be looking actually towards the discourse around art rather than what actually gets done? Do you see what I mean?
No, it's the whole thing.
Okay,
it's the whole
just
thing.
check. There's a question in the middle.
Just one more point. The claim, the argument is a kind of an argument around structure. It's not an argument about parties and so on. So, and it's not as though I'm kind of wanting to disparage certain parties, maybe
Just
some of the people you mentioned, because for me it's a kind of structural condition and it's also an ethos.
Yes.
Right?
So you can't just because I know you're waiting. So to be clear, I cannot get out of this problem by being a better person or being coked out of my mind all the time or writing really intelligent press releases.
Maybe a combination.
Suhail, so I'm curious, because you say that your talk, the way you organize it, it can be made without talking about artists or art objects, artworks. So I'm curious to know about the decision of inviting Liam, an artist, to respond to you. And then I would also ask you about the responsibilities of the artist's responsibilities and the schema that you presented us.
What's
in
the
the art,
second part of that question?
I'm curious. I want to hear from you, like the artist's responsibilities.
Why artists particularly?
Because
and why responsibilities?
Yeah, because you invited Liam to respond to you, so then I think this it came to my mind that
Okay.
I would be curious to know.
Okay, so the people who are invited to respond, to give backstory, I invited some people who I know and admire, and because I know them and I don't know very many people in the States because I'm new to it, I had very few people to turn to, but also I wanted strong responses. Okay? I wanted strong responses. And I also wanted people who I knew at some level I could contest with, which meant not people who would simply disagree with me, or people who would simply agree with me, but I would have kind of maybe challenging, but I think at some level supportive, not supportive of the argument, but interested in engaging with the questions. Liam, I know to be such a person. Me and Richard also thought of inviting other people who I didn't know, some of the critics and so on, who are around in New York, and I think none have accepted. Maybe one. There are some coming up. Yikes! We had a hard time.
Surprise guests.
Okay, surprise guests. Yikes! So it's some ways a practical arrangement. The talk, as I just said to Liam, the argument is a structural argument, and it's everyone's problems involved in the art field now, involving contemporary art. We're trying to do something with art, right? And has claims beyond just here's another work of art. If that's your claim in carrying to contemporary art, it won't make any difference, because it doesn't make any difference. Right?
No, but I to a certain extent, I view it a bit like what you could call a Marx problem rather than a Marxist problem. The fact that Marx, when he was young, was operating within a context which was sort of moving from feudalism to new forms of kind of state and city-state control doesn't mean you can't function or you can't do anything. It's not a sort of, it means there's maybe more urgency to see if there's something else happening or to identify some structural things. So that's how I understand the talk. Do you see what I mean? Just because it shows you that the newly formed Austro-Hungarian Empire is not any better really than the feudalism it replaced, does not mean you cannot continue. Do you see what I mean? That's the way I take it, which isn't just kind of stupid optimism.
That's a kind of excellent support I was seeking by my own entities. But just
So the question is reasonable, and
but just to come back to the artist, thank you. I don't see why. Okay, I think there's I don't see why artists shouldn't respond. Okay? But I don't see artists particularly need to respond or have responsibility to this thing. For me, it's a systemic issue which is determining of the field. So anyone in the field, the institutions, the galleries, the curators, the publishers, distributors, critics, theorists, so on, we're all kind of generating and reproducing this mechanism or this system or this kind of structural condition. So I don't see why I would exclude artists particularly. I don't particularly have any sense that artists are a priority in responding to this.
there's a question at the back, right at the very back. And then one over, sorry.
I'm slightly confused a little bit about the terminology. I understand you're trying to make a structural argument, but it seems to me that, I mean, maybe I'm a little pessimistic, but it seems to me that the contemporary concept or the signifier as it's used in the art world for the last 20 years is a kind of idealist way of dealing with globalization. That is the inherent understanding. Every time you see the word contemporary in a text, whether it's in semiotext or documenta, it's essentially, a riff on this great concept of globalization, whether it's usually with some Marxist strains. So my question is, isn't what we're witnessing a kind of fold of art that is in a mirror of this discourse? So when you say that it doesn't face up to the contemporary art, I feel that indeed it is in a tango with it. So it's indeed facing up to it. It's making love with the concept of the contemporary. So, and vice versa. So what we witness at Documenta, for instance, is this grand tango, this exhibition of this gesture towards dealing with the discourse. And I guess I'm wondering whether the way in which you're addressing it seems to suggest a kind of onus upon the artists or theorists to find a space outside of that where, this is my stupid, perhaps, pessimism, there may not be any space beyond that as sort of a void, since indeed this is the production of the system as it stands today.
Yeah, the contemporary, yes, globalization, it's a predominant theme in the discourse and theories, but it's also just a name for recent work, or work now. That seems to be something that historians take it on.
But it's not of any critical import, really. I mean, we don't really use the word contemporary to talk about art made by, I mean, honestly, a person who's of no relevance within artistic discourse. Really?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's used all the time, say in relation to students I teach. Right? We talk about what are you doing as a contemporary artist, and so it becomes a determinant about whether it becomes a metonym for critical. Contemporary art's critical art, that sort of moment. But as we know, the recent or the work of now is the work that takes place in a global world. So the globalization condition comes in, not just as a determinant, and also that the work itself is understood to be taking in the transnational milieu of the art field, right? Which is the biennials and the documenting the art fairs and the rest of it, which filters all the way through the art system, including into art education, which are now internationally constituted fields. Can I just finish the...
Yeah, sure,
finish
right
the
much time.
So globalization is certainly present. I don't think it's the chief determinant. Globalization is an aspect of the now. But the issue which maybe I should have read out is how do you give a figure, how do you give shape to the global? If you talk about globalization, does it have an identity? And my sense is in the contemporary art field, yes, it's kind of given some sort of performance through the biennial documented global art field. But I still think in that relies upon a sense in which the contemporary is just a name for the now. And what it overlooks is that actually it's a name for a certain type of art practice, a certain mode of address of the artwork. What I want to do is shift the notion of contemporary art to the mode of address of the artwork and restrain it to that, which may or may not be about globalization. It may or may not be whatever the subject is of the topic. The globalization, I think, is an issue of the now, but there's a further question about how it's determined, whether you determine it as a unity or not. And that was the issue around Osborne that I didn't actually flesh out.
A lot of hands went up, and we're going to run out of time, right? So,
We've got time for another couple of questions.
yeah, what I thought might be good is if there's 2 or 3 more, and they could even be in the form of comments on what happened rather than direct questions. Because if people have direct questions for Suhail, they can ask him afterwards. But if anyone has, there was a gentleman over here on the left who's been... Oh, okay. It can always be a comment and observation on what's been discussed, so we can get something.
Let's make quickly then as a comment form. I think this is perhaps a human resources problem, and that part of that is the communication speed, which I'd be interested to see that addressed in future talks. The speed of communication, speed of discourse, and I think to have adequate discourse, you need distance and time for reflection, and to study that system.
Can you just say a little bit what's lying behind your comment? I don't understand.
Oh yes, management science. Yes.
Okay, go to next. We've got 2 more. It's human resources and speed. We're not having the time to... Okay, it's a question, statement question here.
Like now.
My question has to do with Suhail's adequate application of Nitzan and Bichler's work in one of your essays that actually was mentioned at the bottom of the press release for this event. And my question is, I wonder if the multiplicity and the diversity with which contemporary art presents itself to the world is a natural, and by natural I mean unconscious even, way of camouflaging. It's like the univocity or unity through which it actually, like art practice or art production has turned into a singular thing. So like the more the process of art making becomes singular, the more the surface of it becomes diversified.
Do you mean singular integrated or
Yeah,
singular?
integrated, but what I particularly mean is like the way, say, somebody like Peter Gallison defines like objectivity, like or like worldview, which is sort of like practices and virtues of artists. So if you look at how artists make their work, I'm not talking about like the way practice is defined in the discourse of contemporary art, but I'm talking about practices like what they actually do. You know, like the way they make the art, the studio assistant, the studio manager, or like working with curators, working with the dealers, working with publications. These processes are becoming sort of like more and more like singular. And then virtues also, like what they consider like cool or what they aspire to be is sort of like becoming one. And as these kind of converge, the surface of it becomes diverse and becomes kind of like weirder because it can afford to, as long as these things are at the base. Or I don't want to like make it in a sort of like a layer metaphor, but like at some point it's like unified, so another part can be like diversified.
Okay. Any more?
One more. I think, because I take that as a statement. It seems like a good statement. One more.
A quick spiel of bile, not directly towards you, but
I can take it.
yeah, no, the whole October shtick is, I've been reading it for a long time, and there's not a lot of judgment, and with response to you, it's plenty of fucking time. We look at art, and you can tell it's from the 80s, you can tell it's from the 90s, and it's not coming out. Like, what the fuck? We can make a claim, we can make a judgment, it's there. And we're not getting it, and we're not getting this. It's like the problem of the praxis of this global art world, which is bullshit, anti-Marxist, classist, you know, all these problems. The problem of like the art, I mean, where's the judgment? And it seems like this would relate to what you're talking about. I mean, these people are making claims that, to me, as a lover of theory, go against Continental's theories, constantly making judgments and statements. And this seems like I agree with your take, and it seems kind of wimpy.
Okay, just to take the last one first. There might be judgments, but they're not made on the ground of universal determinations. They're subjective judgments. Yeah. So in a way, they kind of return exactly to the condition that's been described by this crew. It might be bullshit, but there's a lot of power associated, not just in the discursive theoretical field, but also through the kind of the art system in which it's integrated, despite its critical, acerbic claims, very well plugged in. Right? So the kind of paradox of the October, I don't want to get into a critique of them particularly, but the paradox of critique at the moment, of course, is that yes, it does, and art practices as well. Yes, they do a lot of criticism, sort of drawing back and vituperative attacks on the systems they're in, but that actually is lubrication, further lubrication for the construction of power. This comes back to your point around the multiplicity of practices. I have no interest in returning to artists as kind of primary producers in the art field. For me, there's a much more interesting conformity of, this might come back to the first of the three comments. For me, there's a much more interesting conformity of contemporary art to the contemporary in a kind of precedence of communication and distribution rather than production. Okay? Not that there isn't production, but distribution takes precedence, communication takes precedence. So of course, you know, the curators and institutions and so on kind of start becoming prominent. But I think that's quite an interesting move to get away from the relying on the artist as a kind of key figure in the field. I don't think artists are any longer. Perhaps they shouldn't be. I'll vouch for that, right? So So around the multiplicity and what you call singularity, but I call integration. Of course, the name for that is that if there's only the experience of the artwork, this is what I'll deal with in the fourth talk more. If there are only experiences of the artwork, subjective judgments, without universal criteria, then anyone's judgment is equally legitimate, so there's a fantastic democratization. But of course that facilitates a kind of an integration, or rather facilitates a performance of the artwork as cultural object without any traction or any kind of point of being able to say no to its acceptance with the subjective judgment. So what you need is a system which at once can take on all art, allow every subjective judgment to be legitimized, and have it operate through institutional structures, and be financed, right? Good name for that is capitalism, which we'll come back to later and pick up point. So I think with the first point around communication, I still don't really understand why that's integral to this topic, other than maybe, yes, there is some sense in which the contemporary is now predominantly determined by communication technology and the rest of it, but actually that's only for a very small fraction of the world, increasingly large, but a very small fraction. But it's also the fraction in which contemporary art does rather well. Right? And there's also a sense in which, the issue would be how certain works very quickly proliferate through the art system, and other works don't. And that doesn't seem to me really to do with the claims of the work itself, but how it can be facilitated within certain discursive fields, which maybe comes back to the last point.
Excellent. I'm going to hand back to Richard.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. Thanks very much to Suhail and Gillick. If you have further questions, please